this lecture, we're going to talk about two of Nietzsche's works which have helped to give him the reputation of being an immoralist. They're entitled Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morals. What we'll be pointing out is that despite the obviously immoralist ring of these titles, that what Nietzsche is targeting in them is actually a particular type of morality, one that he views as particularly unhealthy in its modern manifestations, but that part of his analysis of origins of morality is an indication that even what is now sick might at one time have served really important psychological purposes. The first work in which he talks about the notion of master and slave morality, a kind of basic dichotomy that he uses to describe different types of moralities, is Beyond Good and Evil. There he characterizes two basic types of morality on the basis of the political context in which they originated. For example, some people are in positions of power, and those people are able to look at the world in a very different way than those who are not. Master morality, as he describes it here, is the kind of morality that grows up among those who really don't have anyone to answer to, who are able to more or less be masters of themselves as well as other people. So master morality on this account is a kind of morality that basically asserts itself in the world. It can manifest will to power without any kind of interference from those who are outside of this particular class. In most societies, however, those who are able to do as they please in this way are a pretty small group of people. By contrast, perhaps a larger segment of society are those who have to answer for their various behaviors, and particularly salient among this group are people who are literally enslaved. Slaves are not in a position to do what they want to do. If they were, they wouldn't be slaves. They wouldn't wait on those that they have to wait on. Indeed, in most cases, people have become slaves by virtue of being captured and their way of life more or less destroyed. The kind of morality that develops among people who are in that position is not one that has anything to do with self-assertion, or at least not direct self-assertion. Instead, it's much more a matter of how to live in a way that's going to create the least problem for yourself. Generally speaking, direct self-assertion is not going to be valued very highly because that sort of thing only gets one in trouble. Instead, slave morality on this account is much more a morality that Nietzsche associates with weakness, a position of political weakness, in fact. A slave, for example, would tend to avoid directly confronting someone in charge, a master, though perhaps the slave might harbor quite a bit of resentment on the sly, and indeed might, among other slaves, end up criticizing the master fairly harshly. But this would have to be something that was kept under wraps. Direct challenges would not be particularly approved of. So what Nietzsche sees slave morality as having amounted to was a kind of way of life geared to lack of perturbance, a way of getting through pretty easily, a way of avoiding any kind of posture that would challenge the masters, and indeed a kind of way of satisfying some sense of self-regard or self-esteem without any kind of external challenging or threatening behavior. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he further develops his analysis, not only focusing on this kind of external political origin, although that's an important part of it, but talking a little bit more in detail about what kinds of evaluations masters and slaves make. It becomes a bit more psychological than it is in his account in Beyond Good and Evil. On the whole, Nietzsche does intend, I think, for this model to be seen as a kind of psychological model. He comments at one point that it's quite possible for a single individual to have partially a master morality and partially a slave morality at war within their own soul. So he wants this to be something that we can, in a sense, internalize or reflect upon how much these models might, in a way, still affect our own behavior, even though presumably none of us are in the position of ancient masters or ancient slaves. However, he does think that there is a kind of historical background to all of this that more or less follows the kind of fairly simplistic model he gives. He considers, for instance, how the ancient Hebrews, after a certain point of time, where they were in a sense their own masters, became enslaved. Very clearly, if one reads the Hebrew Bible, this was a situation that a whole people had to deal with. They had to deal with the fact that their former ways of expressing themselves were now viewed as problematic to the state. They had to deal with the fact that they were under the thumb of people who didn't share their religious presuppositions. And the kind of way that they guarded their identity under these circumstances, Nietzsche concludes, was to adopt a certain kind of slave morality, one that's always, in a sense, looking over one's shoulders, but nevertheless asserting oneself on the sly. Similarly, he thinks that those people who were attracted to Christianity initially tended not to be the people that were in charge. It was several centuries into Christian history before a Roman emperor converted, for example. Instead, this was a religion that appealed mostly to underdogs, people who were not in charge, people who were in fact literal slaves under the Roman regime. And for them, again, a kind of morality that appealed to the idea of not threatening people externally, but challenging them only in your own assessment of yourself internally, was a very appealing and workable kind of view to have. So despite the fact that very literally and obviously Christians were persecuted at times in the Roman Empire, Nietzsche thought that at least the morality that Christianity involved was not overtly as challenging as might have been some of the alternatives, and that for many periods of time, people who were in positions of being oppressed gained some kind of self-esteem through Christianity without necessarily challenging the powers that be.
Several lectures ago, we introduced what might be taken as a premise of Nietzsche's moral psychology, the seemingly simple and obvious idea that people do what they want to do. We've tried to make that clear and make it good in a number of different ways. For example, a few lectures ago, Kathy talked about the problem of asceticism, people denying themselves. They want to eat, and they don't. They want to excel, but they hold themselves back. They want wealth, but they deny themselves wealth. Or, in the extreme form, say Thomas à Becket, they give all of their wealth away. Why do people do such a thing? Because it seems to be that they're not doing what they want. And this is something that has to be explained. And the answer, as Kathy put forward, is that they were really doing what they wanted to do, namely they're exercising their power, or they're gaining a feeling of self-righteousness. Or, more easily to put, they were simply delaying gratification or preventing some future harm. So asceticism can be explained not by rejecting, but rather by appealing to the principle that people do what they want to do. Now, an easy way to understand what master morality is all about is it simply takes this premise as straightforward. People do what they want to do. Now, of course, there are all different levels of desires. There are very vulgar desires, but there are also very sophisticated and refined desires. And part of being a master, or to use the word that Nietzsche actually favors and uses much more, part of being noble is not a matter of not doing what you want to do, but to the contrary, making sure that what you want to do is itself noble and refined. So we might think of Don Juan as somebody who does what he wants to do, but the result is not only harmful to other people, but it turns him into a kind of creep. On the other hand, if you think of someone like Mozart, and I'm not talking about his under-the-piano activities, but rather his at-the-piano activities, Mozart, what he wants to do is to compose the perfect piece of music. And so doing what he wants to do, in fact, is doing something that we all want as well. And the consequence of the masters, as Nietzsche puts it, doing what they want to do is to make the entire society more excellent. Now, the masters tend to be individuals. In history, of course, one isn't entirely clear about this, but if you think about the aristocracy, about the ruling class in most states, and certainly the ruling aristocracy as depicted, say, in Homer's Iliad, when you have people like Agamemnon and Menelaus, even though they're brothers and they're related and all that, they're still always very much individuals and kind of semi-at war with one another. But they're very independent people. And the Roman Empire, which Nietzsche perhaps admired more than he should have, You think of all those Roman emperors who hardly had a good deal of family feeling. Well, they were all, in a very straightforward way, out for themselves, and consequently murderous as a result. And the Renaissance, which Nietzsche also admires. If you look at, for example, some of Stendhal's reports of goings-on in the Italian Renaissance, one is shocked by the kind of independence, ruthless and brutal independence, that you find in the masters. But the idea of individuality here is something that, again, is subject to refinement. And, of course, when Nietzsche talks about higher types, he's not talking about the monsters of ancient Rome. He's not talking about the monsters of the Renaissance, even though in one notorious comment he does mention Caesar Borgia, not to praise him, but rather to contrast him and say he'd prefer even a Caesar Borgia to one of the slave types that he wants to put down. But the idea is that the higher type is someone more like Goethe, one of the people he certainly most admires and most frequently mentions in this regard, or artists like Beethoven, Mozart, I presume, other great writers. He wasn't so much involved with painting, but one can imagine any number of, say, romantic and classical artists that might come to mind. In general, what Nietzsche is referring to by doing what you want to do is something that is very refined, and he has by no means praise for anyone doing what they want to do. After all, how could anyone not do what they want to do? That's the premise. But rather, there are certain ways of desiring, and there are certain kinds of ambitions, there are certain kinds of drives that are more noble and better than others. And for the master, what simply drives his or her behavior is the idea of doing what he or she wants, where what he or she wants is ideally to be conceived of as being the best, and being the best as a person, being the best as a citizen, being the best as an artist, being the best as a warrior, or whatever. The truth is that when Nietzsche talks about master morality, one might say there isn't all that much to talk about, because if morality simply consists of doing what you want to do, and what you want to do should be as virtuous, as excellent as possible, and if we're talking about individuals who have different talents and consequently different virtues, different excellences, there's very little by way of a positive ethics or a positive morality with a small m that one can provide. And that's why Nietzsche often says in many of his works, just not, I'm going to tell you what to do, but quite to the contrary. He says, find your own way. Zarathustra in a famous passage says, don't follow me, find your own way. There's an etymology behind this as well. Just as Kathy said that one finds the origins of slave morality, not in the days when, for example, Israel was a mighty nation. King Solomon, no doubt, was just as much of a tyrant, did just as many awful things as the leaders of other great civilizations of the ancient world. But it's when the Hebrews were in exile, when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, that's where what we call morality with a capital M starts its origins. Or in the early Christian days when Christians were by no means the rulers in Rome, but they were being persecuted right and left and so on. That's where it comes from. So slave morality has to be conceived of as a kind of reaction. And Kathy will talk more about that in a moment. A reaction to master morality in particular. The idea of people who can just do what they want. In fact, the very word good, Nietzsche suggests, comes from an ancient root which basically means warrior. And it has to do with a kind of what Aristotle, not the later Christians, would call pride, a sense of being great-souled, a sense of self-confidence, or these days I suppose we might say very high self-esteem. The model of excellence, I mean, what could it be except oneself? This is what people should be. In the very funny play, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. There's a very obnoxious Roman general there who sings a song which goes, basically, I am my own ideal. That is master morality. It's not taking instructions from outside, even if, of course, masters are going to be part of a possibly very long tradition. It's not going to be taking instructions from God, and it's certainly not going to be simply obeying a set of prohibitions. But rather, It's going to be pursuing a sense of excellence which is very much one's own, and that's what the word good means. By contrast, the word bad is its opposite. Bad refers to failure. Bad refers to weakness. Bad refers to pathos, what's pathetic. Bad refers to what's vulgar, what's low class, what is not the best, what is unsatisfying. So you might look at the difference between master and slave morality here, both of them following the basic premise of human behavior. People do what they want to do. The difference is masters accept that, follow it straightforwardly, and their ideal is to simply to be the best that they can be. Whereas those who are not masters, those who are slaves, follow the opposite premise. Don't do what you want to do. Don't try to do what you want to do because you'll only be frustrated. So what they want to do, in a way, is to compensate for that inability to do what they really want to do, and slave morality comes from that.
One of the rather interesting features of Nietzsche's use of the expression good and evil is that he thinks that very dichotomy is a matter that's born of slave morality. If you think about the situation Bob just described, the master doesn't question anything about his or her, usually his, situation. The master is simply filled with self-assertion. There's no reason to question that the way they live is good. On the other hand, for people that became enslaved, there was certainly a reason to doubt their own status. They didn't have any external political status. And if you think about the way the ancient Hebrews dealt with the situation, there are many aspects of the Hebrew Bible, many discussions about what have we done wrong? How could this have happened to us? It led to a great deal of self-questioning. Nietzsche thinks in that context, actually, what the slaves did in developing slave morality was a step in the right psychological direction. He comments, "The slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values." Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, what it means is that the slaves developed their morality by virtue of being resentful. Pretty obvious who they'd resent. They resent the people who have enslaved them. They resent the masters, who can go around being obnoxious as they feel like without even questioning it themselves. And the slave revolt in morals comes when they make that observation. The way the masters are isn't good in itself. In fact, it isn't even very self-controlled. The way the masters are, what the masters assert to be good, the slaves come to view with skepticism. In fact, they end up concluding that it's evil. Even were they in the position of the masters, they imagine, they wouldn't want to act that way. The way the masters behave is not something to admire. Indeed, it's something to despise. And if that's the case, what are they by contrast? Well, as slaves, they're certainly not acting like the masters. And by contrast with this sense that the masters are evil, they can view themselves as good. But notice, this is exactly the reverse of the way the masters evaluate things. The masters see themselves as good without question. Therefore, they see people who are different from them, probably the slaves most obviously, as bad. So Nietzsche views the dichotomy good and bad as something that goes with master evaluations, whereas good and evil comes from the position of the slaves evaluating as slaves. And they reverse who's good. The masters view themselves as good without question. The slaves have to conclude that they're good. They're already in a position of questioning their status, their own morality. And they have to conclude that they're good only on the basis of having seen someone else as worse than themselves. And in this case, it's the masters that they view this way. So what good amounts to from their point of view is not asserting yourself in the kind of direct way that the masters do. It involves having more self-control. Of course, their political position almost ensures that they will have developed some ability in this regard. They view the masters as people who haven't learned these kinds of traits, who haven't learned to be so clever, who haven't learned to be devious, who haven't learned to internally disrespect what externally they might go along with. And that kind of internal move on the part of the slaves, Nietzsche views as a kind of brilliant bit of psychology. The problem is, it later ends up becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that always puts the slave in a kind of secondary position. There is no immediate sense of self-worth without there first having to be a view that someone else is evil.
One can think of this, and let's give it a name, transvaluation of values, a term which Nietzsche uses actually quite frequently. At one point late in his career, was thinking of writing a whole multi-volume series with that as a title. The transvaluation of values might be put in terms of a simple list, that for the masters, the primary sense is good. That good refers to who they are and what they do. Bad is a secondary term. It refers to they're not getting what they want, to their being dissatisfied, or worse. It refers to those people who are so pathetic that they actually never get what they want. The slaves, on the other hand, take what the masters think of as good, and that is evil. It is the primary term. And what's particularly interesting here, as Kathy said, is that good then becomes the derivative term. It becomes the end of an inference. That evil is doing what those guys do that they consider good, whereas what's good for the slaves is not doing all that. So you can think of any number of occasions. For example, wealth has always been thought of in the whole history of humanity since the discovery of valuable things. It's always been thought of as something desirable, and people have always wanted wealth. But then here comes Christianity, and what does it tell you? It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. In other words, wealth is evil. Money, we're told, is the root of all evil. Or, to appeal to a different sense, strength, power, warrior virtues are what the masters have. It's how they remain masters. And consequently, in Christianity, meekness becomes a virtue. Now, of course, this is tied to a theological promise, namely, the meek shall inherit the earth. But again, you can see this sort of flip of evaluation, so that what was good for the masters now becomes evil according to the slaves. And one might even think in terms of knowledge, although this is a more contemporary notion. But if education, knowledge, is something that's good, something to be pursued for its own sake, or pursued because it makes you a more excellent person, then ignorance is bliss, or simple faith is the ideal. There's a sense, though, in which all of this leaves something unanswered. If there are two moralities, and if there were master moralities, and of course we still see master morality at work, even, for example, within the Christian religion, if you think of the history of the Catholic Church, I mean, the most powerful person on earth for many generations was the Pope. Now, on the one hand, he was more powerful than even the most powerful of the Roman emperors. At the same time, he was a Christian. And here's that internal mix we were talking about being both master and slave in the same soul. One imagines what it's like to be a pope, and I'm talking about a devout pope rather than a corrupt pope, but what it's like to be a pope and really believe all the language of slave morality, and at the same time be the most powerful person on earth and be able to do anything you want to do. It would be a very complicated situation. The question is, how did we get to the point where slave morality is simply morality with a capital M? The date one can provide, Kathy mentioned it, would be in basically the 330s AD. It's when Constantine converted himself and the Roman emperor, when Constantine converted both himself and the Roman Empire and actually moved the capital for a while. But more interesting is the mechanism. And while in history the mechanism must have been very complicated, I think the basic strategy can be illustrated in a particularly crude example I sometimes use with my students. We've been emphasizing how what Nietzsche always insists on is naturalistic explanations, which means that we are animals and we should understand ourselves in just that way. So let's use an animal account and talk about how a transformation of this sort might have taken place. Imagine a baboon colony. And if you visit a zoo, you'll see very quickly that the baboons quickly rank themselves in a certain order. At the top of the ranking is always the alpha male. Males among the baboons are much bigger than the females, and also older males tend to be larger and tougher and smarter than the younger males. So you have this ranking where the male baboon does basically whatever he wants. If there's a favored spot in the baboon island, let's say a swing with a tire on it, he takes over and swings whenever he feels like it. And if another baboon is already there, they'll scatter. When the food comes, if he's hungry, he just plows right in and takes it. And the others have to wait their turn. And in general, if he wants to mount, he mounts. If he wants to run, he runs. If he wants to throw things, he throws things. Now, one can imagine slightly intelligent, articulate baboons. Among the beta males and the females, a certain amount of resentment starts building up. Why does he get to do whatever he wants to do and we have to wait in line, or we get mounted without our say-so? And so they invent a story. It can't be that when they get together they could beat up the alpha male. If they could have done that, things would have changed a long time ago. They can't. And so they invent a story, and it goes like this. There's a new zookeeper. And this zookeeper has particular contempt for alpha males. He doesn't like the way they do whatever it is they want to do. And when the zookeeper, who is to be distinguished from the ordinary bloke who comes and delivers the food every day, when the zookeeper finally comes to visit the colony, he is going to make short work of the alpha male. Unless, of course, the alpha male changes his ways. Now, one can imagine that if the alpha male were to hear this story over and over again, over the months or years, he might start to worry. He might start to worry that the zookeeper might actually come, and if all the other apes are right, then he's going to be in big trouble. So he may, like one of the medieval popes, find himself both in a position of absolute power and at the same time filled with a kind of self-constraint, trying to tie himself down and make himself no different from the others. It's a phenomenon that Nietzsche calls bad conscience, and it's something that one often finds, even in us. It's that twist between master morality and slave morality within each of us. And eventually, we can imagine the alpha male actually giving in and stating and acting as if he is just another ape. If that's so, then we can see here's how slave morality becomes the morality. It is accepted not just by the slaves, the lower people themselves, but it is accepted by everyone. Now, in terms of what we talked about before, one can easily appreciate how master morality really lends itself to a kind of virtue ethics analysis. We can also understand how slave morality lends itself to the contrary to a kind of Kantian Judeo-Christian analysis, namely that ethics is universal. The rules are externally imposed, or at least they're externally sanctioned, and they apply in just the same way to everyone.
One of the things we should notice here is that Nietzsche seems to be, in a way, vilifying slave morality. And I think that that's right, even though originally he thinks that it was a good move on the part of the slaves, and, importantly, an expression of their will to power. Being slaves, they had no choice but to want to express themselves in some way, and they did it the best they could. He currently criticizes the type of Christian morality that involves a reflection on other people and their sins as a means of feeling a bit better oneself. He indeed thinks that that's what a lot of Christian morality encourages, noting how other people are just as bad as oneself, if not worse, and particularly looking for sensational tales that point out that some people are really bad sinners, whereas one is only guilty of the all too human. Nietzsche does not, perhaps surprisingly, urge us to go back to master morality. He thinks that's not psychologically possible. But what he does ask is that we move beyond good and evil, beyond simply viewing ourselves in light of how much we can vilify others. And that's where we're going to go on with this discussion next. Thank you.
The central concept in Nietzsche's moral psychology behind the notion of the slave revolt in morals is the concept of resentment, or as he usually puts it in French, ressentiment. It's because of resentment that people do judge one another with an eye to feeling superior themselves. And it's in this sense that Nietzsche encourages us to go beyond good and evil. What we'd like to do in this lecture is to explore the notion of resentment and ressentiment in a bit more detail and understand its various vicissitudes, and also understand its connection to a concept that is not usually associated with Nietzsche, and that is the concept of justice. To begin with, the notion of resentment in English is more particular and more focused than the concept as it exists in French. The French concept of ressentiment is a more general sense of irritation, almost oversensitivity. It's a sense of reactiveness. And it doesn't have the kind of bite that the English word resentment has, and there may be some good sociological explanations for this. But the notion of ressentiment, because it's this more general irritability, this more general reactiveness, also is associated with another concept, one which is, in fact, very closely akin to the concept of justice, and then that's the concept of revenge. In one of the passages that is often cited as proof of Nietzsche's anti-Semitism, he talks about resentment as an act of spiritual revenge. Now, in Nietzsche's defense here, let me say that he says very similar things about Christians in general, particularly in his late book, The Antichrist. And in other books, for example, in Twilight of the Idols, he says equally nasty and cutting things about the German mentality. So I think it doesn't serve as evidence of anti-Semitism, but it shows that he does think very harshly about a certain role that the Jews played in the history of what he calls slave morality. In the Genealogy of Morals, he writes, "The act of most spiritual revenge. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, that is, good equals noble, equals powerful, equals beautiful, equals happy, equals the beloved of God, and hang on to this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, saying, the wretched alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, and they alone are blessed by God. And you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary, the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity, and you shall be in all eternity, the unblessed, the accursed, and damned." Harsh language, to be sure, but the idea here is to capture, in a very cutting phrase, the kind of vehemence with which resentment doesn't just turn values on their head and just doesn't switch labels from good to evil, but rather is a vicious attack. And as Kathy mentioned, an attack that necessarily has to, at least for a long time, stay under wraps. The historical picture here is, of course, a mixed one and very complicated. But what one sees in the psychological portrait is a kind of strategy. And I think what's important here is to understand resentment, and I'll stick with the English expression now, to see resentment as a strategy. To put it in one way, the notion of the transvaluation of values, as Nietzsche puts it, is a way of taking what you aren't very good at, or what you fail at, and turning the failure itself into a virtue. Now, to complicate matters more, later on we'll be talking a little bit about how Nietzsche talks about making style out of one's character, and that includes, for example, taking what you might consider as your flaws and turning them into virtues. But here, he's talking about something that sounds very much the same. The difference is that in the case I just briefly described, what you're doing is making yourself a better person. In the case he there describes, what he's talking about is putting other people down and getting even with them for the superiority. The idea of resentment as strategic is something that's often been discussed in other ways. Nietzsche points out in a passage that's very close to this one in the book how clever, even brilliant, the ancient Hebrews were to make this kind of move. And when you think about it, some of the cleverest, most brilliant people you can think of, I'm thinking, for example, of many editorial writers, are obviously people who are filled with resentment. They're wonderful at the cutting phrase. Or you think of book and movie reviewers, how awkward they sound, even mawkish, when they're talking about how much they love a film. But when they talk about how much they hate a film, boy, are they elegant. And that's the nature of resentment. Resentment is brilliant. And it's brilliant precisely because what it does is it has a stiletto thrust. It's stabbing in the back. The ideal sort of is to kill someone without even their knowing that they've been killed. There's a sense in which resentment as a strategy is not just a matter of getting power, although it's that too, of course. It is also a question of getting revenge, which, of course, is going to get us into the question of justice. Because to make a point very quickly, revenge is the original meaning of the word justice. If you look at the Iliad, for example, what becomes very clear is that when, say, Menelaus at one stage is asking what to do with the Trojan prisoners, and Agamemnon says, you must kill them as a matter of justice, what he's clearly talking about is revenge. It also goes back to a concept we introduced last time, the notion of bad conscience. This idea of two different mentalities, the master mentality and the slave mentality, at war with each other in the same person's soul. Because there's a sense in which one gets revenge on oneself. Here's an example that I often come across in teaching. I have a student come in, a very good student, who's been working on, say, a term paper for several months. And they've consulted with me. They've done lots of research. They've rewritten now several times. And they hand it in, and I find it just terrific. And I tell them so. I say, this is an A-plus paper. I am really proud of what you've done. And almost inevitably, and I don't think this is just a function of Texas, what they will come back with is something like, aw, shucks. And then they'll give me an apology. It could have been better if I had had more time. I should have read these other 15 books. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to write it again. And I just have to kind of clamp down and say, shut up, right? Stop it. I praised you. You did excellent work. And what's going on here in this simple example is just what we've been describing. Because on the one hand, these are good students. They've been brought up to excel. And they work hard and they think of themselves in terms of trying to be the best. At the same time, they've been taught all their lives, don't think you're better than anyone else. And these two mentalities are at war with one another. And the aw shucks response, while to be sure it's a rather gentle version of self-revenge, nevertheless, I think the best way to see it is this is sort of getting even with oneself for doing so well. And this notion of revenge is going to itself have lots of vicissitudes. And the question for Nietzsche is going to be something like, how did we ever move beyond the notion that justice was getting even?
Nietzsche realizes that it would be a rather ironic thing if his analysis of these features of our psychology, of the kind of bad conscience or internal conflicts, were only exacerbated by what he writes about. So, for instance, if we start feeling guilty for feeling guilty, I think he recognizes that would be exactly the opposite of what he hopes his writing will suggest. And what I want to do, just to preface my remarks, is to point out that Nietzsche doesn't think that all of these moves are necessarily bad. In fact, he thinks it's a rather good thing that we're so psychologically complex, that we can actually criticize ourselves internally. He also thinks that up to a point, the kind of initial move of turning a kind of resentful gaze outward is a pretty healthy response. In every one of our lives, probably, we had the experience of having some other little playmate when we were toddlers or a bit beyond call us some mean name, call us a nerd perhaps these days, or a scaredy pants. The response, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is actually a kind of basic slave morality response. It's saying someone who would stoop to the level of calling someone a name like that is hardly worth talking to. And basically, it's someone on the defensive who turns the tables. Nietzsche thinks that much is healthy, and it's no surprise that we internalize the ability to do this. The problem is that as we get used to judging so much on the basis of negating what's outside of us in order to feel good about ourselves, we end up really feeling constantly at war with ourselves when we try to think well of ourselves. Someone who can't take praise on a very well done paper is someone who really has a problem simply feeling good about themselves. There's always that nagging insistence inside, well, am I really sure that this was good enough? Basically, what Nietzsche thinks has happened over time is that the initially healthy move that was made by the early Christians, the ancient Hebrews when they were enslaved, of turning the tables, has become so internalized that there's almost no way one can get enough support in one's own good opinion by means of negative views of those outside oneself. So there's a kind of way in which one drags down one's view of everybody else just in order to feel relatively good about oneself, and that even then, that doesn't give one a kind of self-esteem. Nietzsche's claim is that the whole structure is designed so as not to really give you self-esteem. It's designed to keep you in a kind of precarious position, always looking outside of you to make sure that you really are safe. There's been too much history of looking behind our shoulders, in effect, for us to simply drop the matter. And as I mentioned, Nietzsche thinks that one of the effects of this has been, in a sense, positive. We have become a lot more self-aware. We have developed a lot more subtlety as a species, or at least as a Western culture, by virtue of having learned to look inside ourselves, to make subtle psychological judgments, and to draw some conclusion. Certainly you wonder where Nietzsche himself would be with many of his stiletto-type remarks and analyses, and his analyses of motivations, were it not for this inwardization. Nevertheless, he is attempting to wage war on a couple of concepts that he thinks we would do well to do without. And those particular concepts are guilt and sin. He thinks these two concepts by themselves already indicate very much of the whole structure of slave morality. If one is guilty, in a sense, this is a kind of mark against oneself. That's part of the very substance of what one is. You, in a sense, can't do enough to overcome guilt. Nietzsche isn't, of course, talking about guilt as a kind of practical matter in societies, where one concludes that some people who are accused of crimes actually are guilty. He's instead talking about this inward sense that one is inherently deficient, and that no amount of rectification of oneself or one's way of living in the world could ever fully compensate for that. That, he thinks, is a very unhealthy way of viewing oneself, and one that's only going to motivate resentment and acts of revenge, if possible, on those outside oneself. Even more problematic is the metaphysical notion of sin. Of course, one is guilty of sin, so the two are related concepts. But sin, as we've talked about in an earlier lecture, is a notion that suggests that behavior in this world that is just self-assertion, is just behaving selfishly, following will to power, is being judged on another plane. Just engaging in what one wants to do. When those particular acts are viewed as undesirable, according to either the Ten Commandments or some more refined list of faults based on them, whenever one engages in a sin, one has actually done something not against other people, not necessarily against oneself, but against God, against the whole fundamental order of things. And that this really has challenged God's authority. It's as if the person has put him or herself in the position of a slave that's made a kind of gesture of defiance against the most powerful possible master. There's no way to win at that game. And the consequence of committing a sin is that we've learned to view ourselves, if we're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as completely miserable, completely dastardly, deserving of damnation, not just in this life, but forever. It's a very extreme and actually horrible story that we've simply internalized as part of the way things are. And given, too, that a lot of sins really don't push one very far from acting on the basis of instincts that we all have, that it's pretty hard to live a sinless life by the conventional definition of sin. this kind of sense of just being completely deficient by virtue of being a person with these instincts who acts on them is a terrifying story that basically leaves all of us wanting and needing some kind of way of feeling better about ourselves. Nietzsche thinks that the result is really usually exactly the opposite of what one would expect. You would think that someone who's a miserable sinner would, in a sense, give up at that point. No more sin for me, and hopefully God will provide grace. And indeed, according to the standard account, that is what one hopes for. But Nietzsche thinks psychologically, by putting oneself in this position of always being the bad person who can't possibly do enough to overcome that state, what that does is provide further motivation to avenge oneself on the rest of the world. Look for people who forced you to it. Look for people who fail more miserably than you do. And all of this, Nietzsche thinks, is a really horrible situation. This is one of the reasons why Nietzsche's notion is that the death of God might not be such a bad thing culturally. After all, if the Christian God is central to this story about how we deserve eternal damnation for faults that actually most human beings do engage in at times, if we eliminate that story, perhaps we're going to be in a better view, or going to take a better view of ourselves. The problem, as Nietzsche sees it, is that we're so habituated to the story, so habituated to seeing ourselves as unworthy, that even eliminating the idea of the Christian God isn't going to solve the problem right away. Many people, certainly many people brought up in Orthodox religions, are very likely, in a secular society, to feel that this has been a great loss, that we need this vision of the Christian God looking over our shoulder. Even if the Christian God has actually been portrayed as a very wrathful judge who damns people eternally, nevertheless, the need for the sense that this is the way the world is structured has become, in a sense, so obsessive that without that, people turn to really dangerous alternatives. And I think Nietzsche would view a lot of the horrors of the 20th century in this light. He would probably say that the reason the Führer gained the power that he did was precisely because people had this need for someone to adjudicate across the board, even if what he did was fairly barbarous.
Kathy rather subtly mused aloud, what does Nietzsche's own barbed prose suggest about his resentment? And I think it's an important question, and we should answer it right away, which is Nietzsche was filled with resentment, very much like compassion, which he rather mercilessly criticizes. And yet he was probably one of those passionate men of his age, compassionate men of his age. So too with resentment. It's clear that he recognized in himself all of the problems of the Christian era and the post-Christian era that he was talking about. And so what he was doing, as he would say of every other philosopher, was in part a kind of biography, memoir, confession. So this is a very important question. And I think the way that only has to be answered, which we'll get to in the last lecture, is to what extent can this be justified? And in what way can Nietzsche be seen not just as a man who is expressing his bile, but as a man who, after his own heart, is doing something truly original and creative and expressive? We'll get back to that. What I'd like to do is return to the whole question of resentment, now with the view of complicating the picture a bit. For one thing, one might notice that it's the slaves, not the masters, whom Nietzsche calls brilliant and clever. And it's the slaves, not the masters, who are strategic and, of course, who win the ultimate battle for whose morality gets to be the morality with the capital M. There's a sense in which one can understand this, again, according to an author that Nietzsche, I think, too often ignores, and that's, once again, his German predecessor, Hegel. Hegel has a parable which is called Master and Slave, and people who study German philosophy almost always link Hegel and Nietzsche together in this way. And one of the interesting things about Hegel's parable of master and slave is precisely that they do, as Nietzsche suggests, switch roles. It begins in Hegel with the idea of a battle for, as he puts it, recognition. But more particularly, who recognizes the other as top dog? and the biological metaphor there is quite intentional. They fight, perhaps almost to the death, but of course it's no good for the winner if the loser dies, because then he loses just the recognition as superior that he seeks. So the loser becomes the master's slave. And here's where the master-slave parable really takes off. Because what happens is that the master, who becomes dependent on the slave for all of his daily needs, his physical needs, and perhaps even his entertainment, becomes rather dull-witted, and in fact becomes detached, or the popular word here is alienated, from life itself. He sees life, he experiences life, in a way, only through the slave. The slave, meanwhile, who is in the inferior position, is the one who becomes creative, the one who gets to make things, the one who gets to bake the bread, the one who gets to make the machines. In short, it's the slave who becomes in the independent, more masterly position, and it's the master who falls into the more slavish, dependent position. There's some brilliant stories based on this particular tale. I'm thinking, for example, of a movie by Joseph Losey, one of the blacklisted film directors, who did a movie called The Servant, in which Dirk Bogarde plays a wonderful, devious, strategic, sly servant to a very dull-witted, aristocratic master. And it's very clear in the course of the movie that it's the servant who takes over. Or, more philosophically, Jean-Paul Sartre talks about human relationships in general, and talks about how people who begin in a kind of dependent position, nevertheless, because of the fact that they are in that dependent position, can maneuver themselves into a kind of superior position. So the upshot of this is that what Nietzsche talks about is master-slave morality, and what he talks about as the fruits of resentment, often have a way of twisting themselves around. And of course it can happen again. And one way of understanding what Nietzsche is trying to do is to take those people who are filled with creativity and talent, but who are in some sense being suppressed by the society as a whole, to once again turn this picture upside down once again. The other point to be made, and this is in fact a point against Nietzsche, I think, is that what he calls and criticizes as herd morality, and it has to do with what Kathy was referring to when people are always looking over their shoulder and wondering what other people are thinking of them, and in turn, of course, always imposing their positions on others. This whole sense of herd is something that, with a more neutral vocabulary, might be described as a sense of community. And one of the questions, critical questions that one can ask of Nietzsche is, did he really appreciate what's involved in holding a community together and allowing people to live together? And this, of course, introduces the notion of justice. Justice has been talked about in a great many different ways, and as I suggested, that the original meaning of justice perhaps is to be found exactly in the notion of revenge. But of course today, the notion of justice and the notion of revenge are very sharply distinguished. Susan Jacoby, in a book called Wild Justice, which is really about revenge, says that when she was observing some of the trials of the Holocaust survivors, they were instructed by their lawyers, almost every one of them, to tell the judge, I don't want vengeance, I want justice. And she asked, quite understandably, what really is the difference? How much revenge is there left in the notion of justice? And can we really sever the two all that cleanly? Discussions of justice in recent years have turned largely away from the question of punishment and turned more towards the idea of the distribution of goods. And the question is, how do we fairly distribute? And of course, here's where all those socialist notions and egalitarian notions particularly come into view. And what Nietzsche is concerned about is precisely to what extent does that sense of justice, the idea of equal and fair distribution, not help but interfere with society by once again putting down, suppressing, or leading to the non-existence of truly creative and original individuals.
Nietzsche has rather mixed views about things called justice. and many of his discussions in which he employs the term have to do with the idea that justice, like the expression morality, is often a term used to defend one's own vantage point, to defend one's own superiority. What he has in mind is the notion of those who call for justice, but in fact call for an improved position for themselves. He tends to, I think, overly dramatize the ways in which some people in the socialist movement might talk about equality, and his suggestion is that this notion of trying to give exactly the same thing to everyone doesn't respect justice in another sense, which acknowledges differences among people, differences of effort, differences of goods needed in order to display their talents, and so on. Although I agree with Bob that Nietzsche is not very well probably informed, not very experienced in dealing with human communities, I think that he has a rather interesting view of the whole matter when he emphasizes the individual over the community. It's not, I think, that Nietzsche really wants to say that the individual is supremely important and the community is not, but he questions what kind of community it is we have in mind. And when he talks about the herd, I think he's actually being somewhat playful. He's reminding us that the herd is the Christian flock, the flock of almost identical sheep that nevertheless the good shepherd can find each and every one. That, I think, remains a kind of important image for Nietzsche, not only because it suggests that in a way we're animals and have animal sensibilities, but also that if the good shepherd could recognize each individual sheep, in a way, haven't we lost sight of that when we simply look to see what everyone else is doing and making sure we're doing the same thing? Justice, in Nietzsche's view, would really be to allow for the fact that different individuals have different things to contribute to their societies, and that actually society as a whole would profit if indeed we could acknowledge that. At one point, he has Zarathustra say, "Where is that justice which is love with open eyes?" Which is to suggest a kind of openness to really seeing what people individually have to offer, but also recognizing that if they do things that seem to be irritating, there may be some internal motivation that makes a certain amount of sense. In order to judge fairly, we would really, in a way, have to judge individually, is Nietzsche's point. And that oftentimes the kinds of standards that are viewed as just standards are, he thinks, a kind of way of being just revenged on everyone because you really don't take the time or patience to note the differences.
The problem is that people want to think of justice the way they think of morality, as an absolute, as a single eternal standard. Think, for example, of the statue of Lady Justice with her scales, weighing the one side against the other by some absolute standard. On the other hand, what Nietzsche wants is to say with justice, as he says with morality, that there is no cross-the-board standard, that the idea that there is a single thing called justice is itself an illusion. To make this very domesticated, think, for example, about the kinds of fights that are going on all the time in the United States. For example, about the tax code, about the way taxes are spent, fights between whether people should be treated on the basis of their personal needs, or whether people should be treated all equally, or whether people should be progressively taxed, or whether people should be not taxed at all because because the government doesn't have a right to do so. These, in fact, are different theories of justice, and they've been spelled out by philosophers in very sophisticated ways. The truth is, we don't agree on a standard of justice. And pulling back to a wider focus, what we see is that Nietzsche says, looking across civilizations, there is no single sense of justice either. To think of justice as a personal virtue, instead of as a general rule, a universal law, is once again very close to someone like Aristotle. And I think Nietzsche's concept of justice is ultimately very close to Aristotle's notion of the great-souled man. Key to this idea, although it's usually thought of as a Christian idea, is the idea of forgiveness. But there are two kinds of forgiveness here. There's a sense of forgiveness which the resentful person is perfectly capable of. It's strategic. It's forgiving because you don't have a choice. Or it's forgiving because later on you'll get your revenge. But then there's another kind of forgiveness. It's the forgiveness of being too big to worry about it, of getting over it, of having enough going on in your life so you don't worry about what someone else has done to you. That's justice according to Nietzsche, and it's very different from the kind of often punitive notions of justice that our society practices.